Hello there. Welcome to Creation Station Monthly. I'm Bob from Creation Station. This is our monthly show where we do a really deep dive into one topic with some creators on how they feel about being creative in that particular topic and what keeps them going and running and what really fires up their creative juices on this. Yeah, that word creative I keep using a lot because it's really important around these parts. This month is genealogy. And I know you're like, Bob, wait a minute. How can you do a show about genealogy? Well, that's why I can't. That's why I brought in some wonderful experts with me. I've got Miss LaBrenda Garrett Nelson. How are you doing today, ma'am?
I am doing well, looking forward to chatting about my favorite subject.
It's going to be so much fun. I'm going to let you guys both do full introductions in a minute. And then I've got Eric Thompson. How are you doing, sir?
Doing fine today. Thank you, sir.
I've
Appreciate
known
it.
Eric as a person for years and years and years, and he is I think, knows way more about this topic than I do, and I've actually taught a class or two on this for people. But Miss LaBrenda, you trump us all on this one. Fill us in. Tell us about who you are and why, and how you got into genealogy.
Well, genealogy was a long time kind of avocation of mine. Even for 35 years, I worked as a tax lawyer. I put that aside about 8 years ago and just submerged myself into the world of genealogy, taking classes and preparing myself to apply to the Board for Certification of Genealogists to obtain a credential. And I have been focusing on researching, writing, and teaching. I teach at the major genealogy institutes and am currently serving as the president of the Board for Certification of Genealogists.
There you go, Eric. Follow that up.
That's my story.
I have nothing to follow that up with. This is the expert panelist. I'm the common amateur.
No, let me say, Eric, that I often tell people there are many people doing great work who just don't take the time required to submit a portfolio to the Board for Certification or the other credentialing genealogical organization. But you do, I'm sure you do fine work. I'm one of those people who like letters behind my name so that folks know that I supposedly know what I'm doing.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
And so, Eric, how'd you get into this?
For me, it was, I thought you might ask, so I tried to put it together in my head. My immediate family was scattered all across the Western US, Colorado, Arizona, California, Missouri. And when I was just getting into college, we moved back to Missouri, which is where my parent was from. And about every year, once or twice a year, we would drive 2 hours out to where some of her cousins lived in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, but they had been in that county since before the Civil War, and they had family everywhere. And so my mom and her cousin would talk about their cousins and relatives, and I had no clue who any of these people were. And instead of getting bored and tuning the whole thing out, I started trying to figure out who they were talking about. And then I started taking notes on who these people were, trying to figure it out, and that just kind of snowballed from there.
Nice. So see, there are these things. For the library, I've taught very basic how to access ancestry.com and things like that classes. But then, and by the way, one of the reasons we're doing this month, this does happen to be the 100th anniversary for Alex Haley and Roots, and African American Research Library and Cultural Center, one of the libraries that I did a lot of work at. We have a lot of his original research notes for his novel Roots. And that kind of stuff. So it was really a lot of fun to be able to do that. So I want to get you guys into this. How did you guys start with being interested in this, but then who helped you follow up with that? Like, where did you just make that leap? Ms. LaBrenda, you went into it full professional. How did you get that push off the cliff to go jump into that kind of thing?
Well, let me just begin by mentioning Alex Haley again, because it's great that you have his notes. I like many other people, really got the bug when that book was published, because it kind of told everyone that every family has a story and you can document those stories. And that's what made me start to really focus on doing just that, writing my family story. I have a Southern background. I was raised primarily in New York, but I was raised by Southerners and spent summers in South Carolina in a large extended family where I too heard lots of stories. And before I ever took a course, I had published or self-published 3 editions of my family history book. And a lot of it was correcting things that I had included because someone told me, as opposed to knowing anything about how to do good genealogy. But without, and the other thing to note is that today there are so many free courses and opportunities to get a genealogical education. I didn't really understand that there's a methodology to this as I was doing it before I started taking courses. But I will credit Roots, as I think a lot of people do, with really focusing me on doing this as a vocation. Eric.
I just kind of started with those notes took back in Harrison County, Missouri, which is north central, right up on the border, and just started building from there. My resources started out just asking family. My large age range in the family. You know, I was born in the 60s. My mother was born in the 30s. My grandfather was born in the 1890s. So there's a large list of a large, I guess, memory cache available there of who is who. And like I said, the people I started with were the cousins out there, and they've all lived in that county for what, 150 years now. They knew who everybody was, and it just built from there.
And that does give you an advantage. My family, both my parents were born in the same southern town where their folk have been for a couple of 100 years. My Garrett great-grandfather is buried 2 graves over from his grandmother. So as you say, that just having those kinds of roots and being able to assemble that story is an advantage.
Mm. My father is adopted, and so we don't know anything about his side. So I have traced down his adopted family there, but the biological side through DNA testing and such has made it a lot easier to check on my mother's side.
Yeah, I was going to ask, that was one of my questions was, so you guys both mentioned you wrote down the stories that you were hearing. It came very much from an oral tradition, I'm guessing, from both of you. And especially for African Americans, that was a huge, it was all oral tradition for such a long time. And then finally getting a chance to write that down, how does that help you? Or does it help you when you're going off to go do some of the more modern things? Like Eric, you mentioned doing the DNA stuff. How do those two things work together for you guys, or comparing notes on how it does or doesn't help you in your individual circumstances?
I can begin. I'll tell you that one of the articles, I published an article last year in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, and it was about finding or identifying the parents of my Garrett second great-grandfather. And I used DNA to basically corroborate our oral history. There was no direct evidence about the identity of his parents or any siblings. I met a descendant of another Garrett family, a family I hadn't been aware of, who had more documentation of their relationship to a couple, an enslaved couple, who would have been my second great-grandfather's parents. And I assembled some folk who agreed to take DNA tests. Not everyone agreed, but I also did, and I should mention this, is that DNA alone, and people have to remember this, DNA alone proves nothing, not even parentage, because the areas that the direct-to-consumer companies' tests are the same in identical twins. So you can't even totally rely on DNA if your parent has an identical twin. And beyond the second cousin range or so, you really do need documentation before you even get to DNA. You need to document as much as you can so that you can come up with a testing plan that makes sense. So I added DNA to what was a great deal of indirect evidence, as much evidence as I could glean about my Garrett ancestors, because as you say, Robert, it is particularly difficult for families, African-American families that survived slavery, to document their histories. And I will say, I'm not boasting, that that article won the Award for Excellence this year, that the National Genealogical Society quarterly gives out to basically the best article for the year, because it combined like all of the difficulties of doing African-American research and incorporating DNA into a proof argument where there is no low-hanging fruit to identify an enslaved couple. So I'm particularly pleased about that.
It's good stuff.
How about your DNA journey there, Eric?
On my end, we have a batch of cousins all trying to find our common ancestor. It's Nelson family, and Nelson is not an uncommon name. And so his name is Joseph or John. So to make it even more common of a name, and we're talking back pre-1800, where a lot of the paperwork just doesn't, either they didn't keep it or it didn't survive due to fires and so on. And so several of the cousins are doing the paperwork trail searches, which is not really my forte. I'm a computer science data analyst person. So what I'm doing is I've got a bunch of DNA tests that have been shared with me, and I'm looking for common matches among us all. And I'm trying to find the ones where we don't necessarily know how they're related to us as points to start investigating backwards to see if maybe we can find somebody from one of his brothers or sisters and see if maybe it may come out to nothing, but see if we can find another avenue of attack to figure out who this man was.
And you know, as I mentioned, it's you mentioned the brother or sister. A piece of my evidence was finding my late father and one other person who was a male descendant from a line that was better documented, and they, you know, have the same terminal SNP, as we call it. They were the same haplogroup, and that was additional evidence on top of the autosomal results that I was able to come up with.
Right. We have done a Y-DNA test on a Nelson descendant, and last time I looked at it, it's been a little bit, but the closest match was, I think, about 4 generations out, which wasn't quite close enough to give us any useful. They didn't go back far enough on their tree either to really link in. It did disprove a family rumor, or not really, not 100% disprove, but as Nelson's, one of the stories was that we were a descendant of a cousin of Thomas Nelson Jr., signer of the Declaration of Independence. Our Y-DNA does not match.
Does not match that. Yeah.
Does not match. It's still technically possible, but chances are very slim. So it's one of those things that probably said, hey, he's a Nelson, we're a Nelson, maybe we're related. We're probably cousins somewhere. And it probably just turned into a family's lore story from there.
Well, see, the other issue when you're researching African Americans is that they're still underrepresented in the databases of the major companies. And I was able to find one person in that database who matched a bunch of people from all of the lines I was looking at, which was unusual. But on the Y-DNA test, and I did the big Y test, my late father and this cousin were each other's only matches, for example.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt on this point and say, okay, please define, what do you guys mean when you're saying these wide DNA tests versus these other things? And I heard you throw out a couple of things that I've seen in the commercials for.
Well, let me take
me and 23andMe and stuff. But so just to fill us in, so these are the kind of creative tools you guys are using to go find out, whether it's historical research and we'll get back to that in a minute, but right now using this kind of stuff, what are the things that you've been finding hard to do? Because you did mention also African Americans are not really well represented. Is that just on historical bias, or is that a current bias also, or?
I think, I don't know if it's, it may be the result of an historical bias, but it is what it is. It's a fact. I think it's getting better. 23andMe, for example, they've made a great effort to, years ago, they gave out thousands of kits to people who had four African American grandparents. A few years ago now, they gave out kits to people who had four grandparents who were sub-Saharan African, not African American, because they are, and all of the companies from time to time are kind of refreshing their reference populations and refining them. And so these, what we call biogeographical, that data, a lot of people take DNA tests just to figure out like whether how much are they Scandinavian or English. And as many times as professionals tell them that the only science involved can kind of tell you where your ancestors were on a continental level 1400 years ago, before the advent of transatlantic travel. As many times as we say that if you look at an Englishman and a German and a Frenchman, their DNA really is not that different. Now, I will modify that a bit, because I understand that in Ireland and maybe other places, they are kind of drilling down and are able to, I don't know if it rises to the level of a genetic signature, but they're trying to do what people think they can do already, which they can't. So all of these companies are doing on that point is they're looking at the people in their database, that's the reference population, and they're kind of reporting, people are self-reporting where they are now. And in Africa in particular, people's moved around the whole, it's a huge continent, people moved around, and so you have to extrapolate a lot, but they can tell whether your DNA is sub-Saharan African, for example, and they can tell your haplogroup, and that much they can tell. But there are 4 kinds of tests that they can do, and you have to know something about what the particular DNA, how it's shared, to know what tests to use. In the case of my Garrett DNA study, for example, there's mitochondrial DNA that a mother shares with all of her children, but only females pass it on. So I was trying to find the biological relationship of my second great grandfather, and except in extremely rare cases where there's some sort of mutation, men do not pass on mitochondrial DNA. So there was nothing coming from him that would pass. But if he'd had a sister whom I could identify, I could have maybe compared a descendant of his known sister to a female descendant from the grandmother. So that's one test. The Y DNA is one of the 23rd pair of chromosomes. It's one of what people call the sex chromosome, and it's passed from fathers to sons, and it mutates very slowly. It changes very slowly. And the other thing about it is that all of the other DNA, the X DNA, the autosomes, they recombine with other X chromosomes and other chromosomes. The Y doesn't recombine with anything, and it's a really good way to tell, I guess, whether someone is in a paternal line. Now, it does mutate, so there could be differences in the Y DNA result for people who are descended from the same paternal ancestor, but that's one test. But if you don't have, there are lines that people say have daughted out because there are no men to test. Well, then you can't compare Y DNA among, there are no. Go ahead, Eric.
My wife's family is in that situation. Her father was one of 4 sons and a sister, but all of them have had daughters. And so,
and sometimes if you do the documentary work, as you were suggesting, Eric, you could go back farther in time. and try to find someone descended from some remote ancestor who might have the Y DNA in question. But so that those are two kinds of DNA. The X DNA is a father passes it only to a daughter, and a mother passes it to all of her children. So, and if a mother passes it to a daughter, the daughter's going to get some combination of what the mother got from both her parents. The father basically passes what he got from his mother onto the daughter. All of that is information that you need to have to figure out whether you even have any candidates for comparing X DNA. So in my study, and I mentioned it in the article, there were two women in my study who conceivably could have obtained X DNA from my third great grandmother, and one was the descendant of one of the sons, the third great grandmother's sons, who gave it to his daughter, who would have given it to her daughter, but they didn't match. They were potential candidates, but they didn't match. So in my DNA study, the only possibilities, given the candidates I had for testing, were Y DNA and those first 22 autosomes that you get from both parents and going many generations back. I can go on and on.
No, I'm sitting here listening to you two just going on. Fill us in, Eric. Tell us.
On my side, I'm looking at it more in I guess more shotgun style. Is I've had a bunch of cousins share their tests with me, and I've only one or two of them were ones I had asked. These were people independent. These families were not in touch with each other, but they've shared their tests with me. I've shared ours with them, and I've just trying to assemble all the data, all the matches, and I'm looking for this person looks interesting or this person looks interesting. And the problem is part collecting the data and part sifting through it. You're trying to pan the gold from the gravel. I mean, nobody's gravel, but if you're looking for one type of thing, you're trying to pick those people out. And the test that we have for my family is got 56,000 plus matches on Ancestry.
And can I just mention, let me tell you that's the other difference between everybody else in those databases and African Americans. I have maybe 2,000 to 3,000 matches, and I sit in courses because I continue to take courses, and I'm hearing people talk about 15,000 matches and 30,000 matches. Well, that's just not happening with African Americans. But go ahead, Eric.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, it's they have the data depending on how many people have done tests, and if a population hasn't done tests, the data is just not there. I mean, I think the smallest one I've got is 15 or 20,000 of all the ones that have been shared with me, and the highest is in the 60,000s.
Now, just a caveat to that, I took a course just very recently, and it was on the statistical aspects of the way in which this data is reported. And so, for example, they were talking about the haplogroups of Native Americans, and I asked the question. My understanding is that Native Americans hardly tested all, so how did they come up with these haplogroups? And the response was that is true, that I guess on a percentage-wise, there are fewer Native Americans than there are even African Americans. But because they were so isolated for so long before the advent of transatlantic travel, among the few that have tested, give you a pretty good, you can make a pretty good prediction based on the few that have tested. The instructor actually used, I won't even go into the very simplistic example that she used, but I got the point that it is possible to extrapolate information even when you don't have a lot of folk who have tested. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, there's some very advanced statistical tools that can be applied to this. I am not qualified to discuss them. I've got a mathematics degree, but I'm not anywhere near the level to do any of that.
Have you used something? I took a 3-hour course and I don't really understand it, but have you used Gephi to try to sort your DNA matches?
I actually just downloaded that a couple of weeks ago. So my biggest problem right now is, well, I'm still gathering the data, but I tried to load everything into it and I overloaded the program. So I'm going to have to pick and
'Cause-
sort before I.
Because as it was explained to me, it is a way to try and kind of sort through thousands, because they do auto clusters and you can
Yes.
try to figure out who's related to, how people are related and that kind of thing.
Right. And I don't, still very basic beginner on that. I'm still trying to get the information to put in there and make it work. Just having the tool isn't necessarily enough. You have to, I guess, tell it to do the right thing.
So I don't want to leave people with the impression that this is impossible to do, because a lot of genealogists are still, I mean, they've said to me, they're not going to learn this. And there are experts, there are genetic genealogists, and they will leave all of this to them. But I really do believe that there will come a day when everyone routinely will consider, is this a problem that where DNA testing might help? And it's not, because I don't consider myself an expert, even though I've lectured on the subject, but I learned enough, took enough courses at institutes and listened to webinars and read all of the books that are out there, and there aren't that many, to understand what I need to do for my particular research problem. And that is what people have to, it is something you have to, as Robert mentioned, we're throwing around this nomenclature. So you need to be familiar with that and understand something about DNA, but it's just another tool that you can learn to use. Especially, I think it's especially important for African Americans because there's so little in the way of direct evidence.
Yeah.
Along those lines, Eric, I want to interrupt you on that one just for a second. So, keeping along that idea there, you guys both kind of almost touched on it and then skirted away of privacy, and we're going to take everyone's DNA and we're going to put it all into a database, and some people already have it in a database or not. What do you guys think? What do you two think about the idea of hesitancy of somebody wanting that in a database versus the validity of it? As you were pointing out, some of these aren't even that valid.
There are a couple of things, and one is that, and I do this on matters not having to do with genealogy or DNA, you need to read the terms of service of any of the companies that you're uploading DNA to. And too many people don't do that. There was quite a controversy, I think it's still ongoing, about the use of law enforcement's access to DNA in these databases. And some of the companies have been very clear that it would take a subpoena for them to give up the DNA. And several of the companies have been more willing to consult with law enforcement. And one company, I think, lost a bunch of accounts because they were so willing. But all that I ever say about it, not wanting to, particularly given my current position and not wanting to take sides, is that when you ask someone to test for you, especially, you need to make sure that they understand all of this. And in fact, the Board for Certification of Genealogists created the Phil's first code of ethics. And a few years ago, we updated it, and very recently we updated it, both times to reflect the use of DNA. And how and put in provisions to protect the public, and also just to make sure that people get informed consent when they're asking people to use their DNA to either upload it or to take a test. I had many people say no, that they didn't want to take the test at all. And then the GEDmatch, which is the company that offers a bunch of free tools that the other companies don't offer. They were that was the database used to catch, the Golden State Killer, and some people were upset about that. And so that was another step in my process when even the people who took tests for me, when I asked, can I upload your stuff to GEDmatch? Some of them, and this is even before the Golden State Killer thing, but some of them said no. So all of that's kind of the hand-holding side of all of this, kind of making sure you get informed consent and that people understand what it is. Because the fact of the matter is, none of our data is really, really secure. No one can guarantee you that there won't be a data breach, and that I took comfort from hearing one of the genealogists, a true expert, say that what are they going to do even if they get it? What are they going to do with your DNA? It would take some sort of really expert scientists to figure out what, if anything, they could do with it. I take comfort in that.
Yeah, and it's definitely a matter of, I guess, interest and privacy on what your people are comfortable with. I mean, most of the folks I work with on this, they went and did it themselves. There were a couple of cases where I asked somebody if they were interested, and if they said no, they said no. And if they said yes, then we went through and got a test done for them. But most of the ones I'm working with, they got into it themselves, and they're interested in it, and they're, and then we're all working together on this one particular project, and they're also researching their other families. And
That's interesting, because all of my test takers, I went out and solicited tests, but I found that one person in the database that we used who agreed to that I could use his results in my study.
Right. Well, on my side, my one parent is adopted and has no interest in knowing or finding anything out about their birth family. And so that's why I don't have a DNA test of myself taken, because half of my DNA comes from that parent and would therefore return information on that side of the birth family.
And so he just doesn't want to know that. So just don't do the test. He does not want to know.
Right. Just don't do the test. And so we paper trail research through the adoptive family. I've got a cousin on that side. He's done DNA test for searching his family out. It doesn't apply to my family. The DNA test doesn't, but he's done great work on the paperwork side of things and research. And I'm more than happy to look at everything he's done there and include it in my family. I found a few things for him, but most of it's been him on that one.
Yeah. What is a surprising thing? Not so much look what we found in our family tree thing. Everybody's out there, how much Neanderthal do you have, or the TV show stuff that they do. I'm not talking about those things. What is the thing that you found that was different, that before you started really getting into this, that you discovered afterwards, like, oh, wait, I'm really having fun doing this part of it? Or wait, I didn't know I could do that kind of thing. If for somebody else who's out there just kind of toying with this idea in the back of their mind, what do you think is that aha moment that you were like, oh, wow, this is different?
I think, and I'll tell you that when I lecture on methodology, but my focus is on African American families, my personal research that survived slavery, because there are lots of different kinds of African Americans today. So that is my focus. And there is so much that people don't know. Americans generally are just woefully ignorant about history. Like, I've spoken to young people who don't understand that about 10% of African Americans were free before the Civil War, and half of those people lived in the South. They lived in the slave states. It wasn't that, not all free Black people lived in the North, and they don't understand what the laws that affected people were. For enslaved people, for example, because they were treated as property, could not legally marry. There was no marriage is a contract. People don't think of it that way, but a property can't contract with anybody. And in all of the slave states, an enslaved person couldn't marry another enslaved person, and they couldn't even marry a free person. And the status of a child followed that of the mother. So if the mother was enslaved, it wouldn't matter who the father was or whether the father was free or Black or white. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. And so there are all of those historical aspects of this work that I like to dig into and to share with folks, because it really does inform your research plan in terms of what records you might find. One of the things I've paid more attention to lately are women's property rights, because that tells you something about possible paper trails for you to follow. people don't realize how very recent it is, that even here, long after the American Revolution, that women had no property rights unless their families were well off enough to put property in trust for them. And even then, there are a bunches of equity court cases where mainly creditors were trying to get at property that a wife brought to a marriage. But all of that, because you start with the premise of an enslaved person as property, all of those kinds of laws and social conditions really do, you really need to know about that to even begin to figure out where sources or records might be located that could name your ancestor. So that's just something of interest to me. And just more generally, I just think, I think this is true whatever your race, but that young people should be made aware of kind of the shoulders they stand on. I really do believe that every family has an interesting story. There's no, if people have lived, there's something of interest to that you can find that would be a source of pride for other family members. And so I've that's part of the reason I like to lecture, to kind of bring those kinds of things to the forefront.
For me, I guess the most interesting, I guess, humanizing for the ancestors is newspaper sites. Searching for a name in the newspapers, because there are plenty of local newspapers that just talk about what's happening in that county. I found out one ancestor was a house mover, not pack up the belongings and move them from this house to this house, jack the entire house up, put it on a wagon, and move it to another town or to the other side of the same town. And that's not something we think about these days because we don't build our houses that way. But a lot of your ancestors won't show up in the newspaper. I mean, it's just the way it is. But you might find one here or there, and it seems to be that once somebody's in a newspaper once, at least from my family, once they're in a newspaper once, they tend to show up quite a bit. Whether it's because there's just not many people to talk about, and so they tend to or they're just that interesting of a person. Whether it's a good interesting or bad interesting depends on the person.
Yeah, there we go. I have those stories about my grandfather. Both my grandparents on my father's side were blind for almost, shortly thereafter they had met. And raising kids and raising grandchildren and everything like that. Those stories, yeah, it's that being able to tell other people about, well, no, wait, this is where I came from. This is where I get those ideas. That, yeah, no, anybody can do anything. Look, I know, I've got people who did. It's really, really fun, guys. So here's the thing I want to ask. What is the one thing that you're proudest of that you've been able to pull off? That you've been able to, and especially in this field in particular. And we're going to come back to that other side question there in just a minute. But what do you think, Eric? What's something that you're proud of that you've been able to pull off with this to that might surprise other people who haven't really taken an interest in genealogy?
Yeah, I was not expecting that question. I have a couple interesting ancestral stories, but what I'm proud of finding, I don't know. I think probably just finding the stories, finding the ancestor who was in prison was jailed for debt, or finding I did not go into this expecting to find famous people in my ancestry. I came close with one ancestor who Abraham Lincoln is not an ancestor, not a relative, unless you go back really far, in which case he is a relative to all of us. But Abraham Lincoln's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. He was only defeated once by my second great-grandfather.
I've already talked about the thing I'm most proud of, getting that article published.
I had nothing like that.
That was decades of research. If you look at the footnotes, there's an interview I did of someone in 1986, and so it's getting it published in a peer-reviewed journal, which means that in a premier peer-reviewed journal, and on the cover is my great-grandfather, so his bio is in the inside issue, cover of that issue. That is the thing I'm most proud of having accomplished. I'm glad I waited to publish this article until I had all of the indirect evidence I was able to glean, and then to add DNA evidence on top, which is what made it interesting. But that is kind of in my personal research, what I'm focused on is I've published another article in the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society's journal on another line, my paternal grandmother's Neely family. I'm really focused on trying to show people how all of this can be documented in a way that makes this really your family history and not just family lore that because a lot of Black people don't think, and I think a lot of people don't think, that African Americans who came out of slavery can document their histories. I, for example, in my Garrett article, one of my fourth great grandmothers, I have a bill of sale that was in among the loose papers in an equity court case that says that she was purchased as a 2-year-old in Virginia and brought to my home county in South Carolina, and in the possession of this family until she was in her mid to late 20s, when at the point at which she'd had 5 children and the heirs of this family were fighting over her, and because the children of an enslaved woman belonged to her enslaver, this case basically decided her fate and the fate of her children. But several times in the pleadings, there's just a clear statement that she is the mother of all of these 5 children, including my 3rd great grandmother who married a Garrett. And it's just that kind of stuff that I find thrilling, that you can, and it takes work. That's the other thing. That's not low-hanging fruit too.
No, it is not. It is hard work finding that stuff. That kind
But it's
of
possible.
documentation.
But it's possible, and that's what I'm trying to show people.
Yeah.
And that leads me right back into the other question there for both of you is, what do you think the rest of the world thinks about genealogy? I mean, we've done these episodes every month, and we've done all sorts of different things. And genealogy is a different thing because you always get at least I've always had the feeling that somebody thinks, oh, sure, anyone can do this. And I think we've got some comparisons here to do. But what do you think that in general the rest of the world thinks about this as a creative, scientific journey kind of thing?
Go ahead, Eric. I was just going to say that I think that the field is very different from what it was even 20 years ago. That 25 years ago, I think there was maybe one national institute held at the National Archives, and now there are at least 5 national institutes, and many regional institutes, and all of these opportunities for people to learn about genealogy. And I think the interest in it, DNA has helped kind of revive an interest in it, but Roots, the book, certainly kickstarted a generation of people interested in finding out about their families. And I think in the late 70s, 1979, I think the Association of Professional Genealogists was formed. The Board for Certification of Genealogists was organized in 1964. So I really do believe that it is viewed as more of a discipline now than it was kind of 30 years ago, and that will only get better. And so, but you're absolutely right that there are people who don't understand that this is a discipline and it takes work, and that there is a methodology to doing it. And I'm kind of doing what I can to disabuse people of that idea.
And for me, what I would say is, if you want to get into it, great, get into it. But make sure when you put stuff into your tree, whatever method you use to do it, document where it came from. There are thousands of trees I see that link to my ancestors, and I look at their data and they say this person born here, married this person, had these 5 children or whatever, and there's no sources whatsoever. I have no idea where they got this information at all. It could be from census, or it could be from somebody who has the same name, lived in the same town at about the same time, and they confuse the two people, and so they've mixed families. And so if you get something word of mouth from, a great aunt saying, my dad married this person, when you put it in your tree, say from, told to me by X person, and identify who that person is. So that way, if somebody else is looking at your tree, they can judge, well, do they think this is accurate or not? Because people's memories may not be accurate. But anybody can do it. But if you don't bother to
Educate
write down,
yourself.
educate yourself, or
Yeah.
put the information in there so that other people can see what you did. I've heard it called junk genealogy, where you just list names out and throw names and people in it, and nobody can tell how accurate it is. It's easy to claim that you're, third cousin of Marilyn Monroe, but if you don't have the documentation to prove it, it means nothing really. And so, yes, there is some work involved in that. With the computerization of the records, it makes it a lot easier to find information now. Used to be, back in '79, you had to travel
Exactly.
to county courthouses to get your records, and most people just didn't do that. I have I guess he'd be an uncle-in-law, my wife's great uncle, I think, actually. Yeah, great uncle. He had actually published a book or two about their family, and he did that travel. And so, it's great information in there. I'm not going to travel around all the country looking for these places. I'd have to go to Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska and Ohio and Virginia and Kentucky and Missouri again. And it's just, that's one of the problems, I think, or not really a problem. It's a possibly unique thing about the United States versus European genealogy. I was just talking with somebody yesterday in the UK who has done their genealogy. Our families traveled a lot more all over the place. Distance is a huge factor in the United States history. Whereas in England and Scotland and Ireland, there just wasn't that far to travel until you actually emigrated someplace else. I mean, people still did it, but it's not that far as it is here. Now they have hundreds of years of history to dig through, whereas we've only got a little over 200 years. Well, more than that, but you know what I mean.
About 400.
Yeah, 400 years. So we have less depth to look at, but more breadth.
Right, which is why one of the things you have to learn when you're doing this work is about migration patterns, how the country spread westward, what happened when. One of the trick questions in a course that I taught in was about finding a birth certificate or a birth record in 1750 in Pittsburgh. And the trick answer is that Pittsburgh was a wilderness in 1750. So you have to know that stuff.
Right. My grandfather, or one of my grandfathers, was born, hold on a second, 1911 in Oklahoma. And that was the year they started requiring birth certificates. But apparently they just didn't get to him. Not everybody filed them at that point. And so
Well, that's exactly the case in a lot of these places. A lot of the southern states were late in requiring the statewide registration of birth certificates. And my late father-in-law was born the first year it was required in South Carolina, and there's no birth certificate for him. It took a while. By 1930, most places routinely did it, but before that, it was kind of a toss-up.
Yeah.
Okay, so my next question for you guys, I'm going to throw out one answer you're not allowed to use, which is a time machine.
Okay.
What is the one piece of equipment you really would love to have to be able to, or equipment or type or something to make this, your ability to do this so much easier, to be better at it, et cetera, and stuff like that?
A time
And
machine.
you don't get to go, you don't get to go back with the time machine to go pick and choose things.
I don't.
What is there that's in the modern world that you could envision happening?
What I can envision happening, because I know it happens. I have a friend in the Netherlands. She's one of our international associates. She's certified by the Board for Certification, but lives in the Netherlands, and all of their records are digitized. Now they're a much smaller country, true, but I can see a day when that will be true here. Maybe not everything, but a lot is online and more is coming online every day. So you can do a lot from the comfort of your home, but you still, Eric, to really do the job right, have to travel, as you say. You know, you can pick up information from grave markers and country graveyards, that kind of thing, or from records that were never filed where they should have been filed, but they're in county courthouses or in basements. Or so that's what I would love to see happen. That would make life infinitely easier if everything you needed to do what we call a reasonably exhaustive research could be found online.
Mhm. And even if it's
Now I'm
digitized,
wondering, Eric, I get a
right?
question. You may not, you probably don't know this one, Eric, either, but I'm gonna, now you're making me go look here. If I can do Google Earth to go wander through graveyards, if the quality of the images on a Google Maps, Google Earth kind of thing is good enough to read gravestone markers, if any, no,
You
okay.
know, there
I
are
was
two
trying.
there
Nope.
are actually two websites, Billion Graves and Find a Grave,
Mhm.
where people are doing that. I think Find a Grave, I'm not familiar, I don't really use Billion Graves,
I
but
don't know that.
Find a Grave, they're really particular about how you enter the information and they'll take a photograph. So that helps a lot. But again,
Yes.
is every country graveyard in there yet? It's really amazing how much is online now. That is true.
Yes. Yeah. I take my kids out every once in a while to do find a grave for our local cemetery. People put in
That's
requests
great.
and we'll go look for their stones. Um, Again, with everything else, you have to look at the information they give you, because on Find a Grave, they'll list out the family members, but there's no sources. And even where they're buried might not be accurate. And
Right.
that's if there's no gravestone, because people are maintaining this. I've had one ancestor where the person said she was buried with her husband in said cemetery. Well, he died 20, 30 years after she did. She's not in that cemetery. I did find the newspaper archives in the county courthouse, in the old newspaper archives. Went through microfiche, and I found her obituary, and it said she was sent to her home county. And I notified the person who keeps her site, who maintains her site, and so she moved it from the cemetery where her husband was buried to the cemetery where her father was buried. Problem again, she died before her father did. So I have no idea where she is buried yet. Nobody in that, it is a county that the town where they grew up no longer exists. And I haven't made the trip out there. Same person on her marriage certificate with the digitization, it wasn't in searches, it wasn't found because the scan was whited out, it glared out. So the name wasn't legible to the OCR,
Yeah.
the optical character reader. I went through page by page looking at every single one. I said, this could be them. And my goddaughter lived close enough to the area she could drive up there and take a picture of it herself and send that to me. And it was their marriage certificate. So that told me, the date and where they were married. It was on her father's land. But
That's awesome, guys. Um, we just flew through a whole hour.
yes, we can keep going if you want.
I would keep going forever. You guys this is really fun. This is really entertaining. I want to wrap up with one last thing. What's your advice to someone who wants to start out? I mean, they've heard all this stuff for the last hour. Something that someone told you that you're like, wait a minute, this is the one nugget. Go forth with this, and you'll enjoy looking at genealogy. Whether it's, because maybe somebody doesn't want to, or they're not so into full research, but they think they might be. What would you tell them to go do? What would you tell them to, as a spark of interest, to see if they really like doing this?
I'm a big advocate of trying to kind of capture the memories of our elders. So I encourage young people to talk to their elders, to get so that their family stories don't die. Just start out by talking to your elders.
Yeah, I agree. Start with your immediate family, get their information, and try to get it written down. An oral story is great, but they can be forgotten. I didn't get started on this until after I didn't have any grandparents left. So I don't have their stories directly, but I talked to my mother, I talked to my father, I talked to my aunts, I talked to those cousins out in Missouri, and I tried to get some of those and turn your genealogy into people watching. Who are these people? Not just names and dates necessarily, if you can. A lot of it is going to just be names and dates, but from there, who were they as people? And I guess don't go into it just trying to find the famous person you're related to. You're not most likely not going to find a famous person. That I think that's one of the things that kind of annoys me with a lot of the surface levels. They're just going back. They're trying to find the duke or whatever they're descended from, or the princess, or or the politician. Most people are going to be farmers or shopkeepers or something similar, or less fortunately, slaves. But they were still people. Who are they? Where were they born? What were their lives like? Try to turn it into something more than just names on pages.
That is an excellent ending for us, sir. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Miss LaBrenda. You guys were so much fun with this, and I'm definitely proud to have both of you guys on here. I want to remind everybody, we do this every month. Creation Station Monthly, creationstation@broward.org comes right to me. If you have a question for a topic, if you want to reach out to one of our guests, please join us again next month. We will see you soon, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thank you.